major ideas within constructivism. And I can tell you that constructivism is a very interesting thought framework to think about. I've studied Alexander Wendt, Onef Kratochvil, some of the proponents, the big guys in the field, and I'm quite fond of constructivism. So we will have a lecture, but we will be talking about it, and I will also give you some of my personal ideas about what I think of constructivism and why I feel attracted to the idea of constructivism. So let's start with the first slide. Constructivism became actually quite interesting. People started to feel interested because of the end of the Cold War. And the end of the Cold War actually meant that there was a structural change. So from the constructivist vision perspective, the realistic or realism or neorealism was not capable as an ideological framework, as a theory. It was unable to explain why there was a structural change. So one of the biggest commentaries of constructivists against realists is that they cannot explain structural change. Well, if you ask the realists, they can explain structural change by way of the distribution of material forces, obviously, within the structural international arena. Liberals would argue, contrary to constructivists, that the institutional argument would play an important role within the international arena, which is why there is more trade and business as a priority, and that these institutions play an important role, an explanatory role. So we're talking about the independent variable from an empirical point of view, how the independent variable would explain the dependent variable. So the behavior of agents, of actors, how do we explain that? So this is the whole discussion that we're talking about today. And something happened obviously during the 90s, 1989 and 1990, and the Soviet Union collapsed. So the big question was, why did the Soviet Union collapse? And the constructivists say, well, we can explain this by structural change, because structure is always in the process. So we will be talking about structure and process. We will be talking about agency structure dichotomy today, and this is the biggest debate, the debate between the three schools of thought. So for realism, states are self-interested actors. These self-interested actors compete within the international arena for power and distribution of capabilities, for a balance of power, creating hierarchy within an anarchic international arena. So realistic way of looking at things is a bit survivalist, right? So it's the nature of things, and the nature of things is about survival. So living, existing beings want to survive and exist, and this urge is natural, and this natural urge, the need to survive, is very, very powerful, and it looks for that element of power and be able to use that power to create hierarchies within the international arena. So this is very Hobbesian, right? And there is this element of enmity. There is this element of creating enemies, right? So there is this superiority and inferiority within that hierarchy, and it's the law of the nature. So having established the foundations of the discussion, the dominant focus on from the realism is the survival instincts, the traditional theories lack this notion of agency, but they define agency in terms of survival, and the state wanting to survive instead of ideas, instead of culture, instead of individuals and identities. So these words, these phrases that you can see on the first slide are very important: ideas, identities, cultures, and individuals, obviously. So eventually it was the action of the leaders, the individuals. So the individuals and their ideas. So if these individuals like Khrushchev, during the 60s, Kennedy, if they believed, if they were really truly realists, if this was the truth, the only reality, they would have pushed the button, the red button for the bomb, right? So, but they didn't do it. So realism has this assumption that the human being is violent and survivalist, but these individuals, they did not go into war. Okay, so that makes the constructivists think. So since they didn't go into war, since they made a choice, they thought about it, and that idea of not willing to go into war, the destructive big war, that was an idea. Okay, so those ideas, that notion, the structural notion, it's not the material argument, it's not the material force argument, but it is the structure, the distribution of ideas within the structural setting, the superstructure, which is, the whole states all together within the international arena. So, constructivists would say we are able to explain this by mere, the independent variable idea. We can explain this behavior of states and individuals, but realists, they cannot. And, the truth is that realists as well as liberals were taken by surprise when there was a structural change, meaning that the Soviet Union had collapsed. So constructivists say it's not only about material forces. Okay. Moving to the next slide. So let's remember what we mean by structure, because it remains important in our discussion, in our debate. For realism, structure describes the configuration of the units. And what we mean by this, configuration of units is that we mean that the distribution of material forces, because based on the natural instinct, the nature, by birth, innate, it's the way it is. Human beings are aggressive. Human beings come into the world by sin, as sinners. So this notion, this idea, is what we would call structure. So the example that we used last time was if you play a poker game, it's the distribution of chips, the distribution of money. How much money do you have? How much money do I have? If I have more, I will take more risk. If you have more chips, you will take more risks. So it's that distribution. That's structural thinking. For realists, it's very, very important. They are also called the structuralists, right? So the process, what we mean by the word process is it's about the interaction. So when we say process, you think of interaction. Or the interaction is also the rules, the norms, the rules, the laws, the process, okay? But for constructivists, process is actually the interaction between ideas, the interaction between agents and structure. It's the interaction between individuals. It's the interaction between states. It's about process of interaction, okay? So for the realist, structure is the distribution of power, material power, and the process is how the game is played. How is the game played? What are the rules and the rules of interaction? So how do you interact when one president talks to the other president? What are the rules of the game? and sometimes you see, for example, a powerful president. They have this way of interacting with each other. For example, when they shake hands, right? So if they give their hands like this, it means I'm powerful. Sometimes they do this, and then they shake hands, and sometimes they do this, so it comes down. I'm dominant. So it's the what rules are we going to conduct? Individual rules or interactive rules? That's the process. But you can think of a process in a wider array. It's not only individual interaction. It's also diplomacy. It's also exactly Trump's handshaking, for example, and they try to dominate each other. But it's you could think of it as a game, but that's structure and process are important. For the realist, structure and process are defined. They are set. It cannot be changed. For the constructivist, things can change. So that's the biggest difference. So we will move on, and I will try to explain what we mean by constructivism. So according to constructivism, realists cannot explain foreign policy, but they can explain international balancing politics. So the difference here is international politics versus foreign policy. Okay, so when we think of A, international politics, B, foreign policy, international politics for realists is about balancing. It's about the balancing act between states and the power, how power is being distributed. But foreign policy is something else. Foreign policy is not identical or synonymous for international politics from the constructivist perspective. For the constructivist, foreign policy is about the process and the relationship of the process with structure. And this relationship is reciprocal. It means that there is an interaction between process and the structure, and it means that it needs to be sometimes subtle. So incidents and situations can change and differ. So in that sense, the international or the foreign policy is about for constructives is more social. So foreign policy needs to be social. There is this process rules, and that's why it's not really material. It is, constructives would say, okay, it is material up to an extent, but it's not only material. It's also very, very much social. Social structure, identities, and interests. These social structures, we talk about structure, power structure, but for constructivists, the international arena is about social structures. So for a constructivist, people like me, we think that the international arena is also it's also very much social structures of human association and are determined primarily by shared ideas rather than material forces. The second point is that there is a relationship between identities and interests, the state interests. When we're talking about identities and interests, we're talking about state identities and state interests. So for a constructivist, the state interest is defined by the state identity of the state. In this case, the agent is the state. Okay, interests are constructed. So it's all about this construction. It's made, it's developed, it's realized, it's established by human interaction, by ideas. And these are shared by citizens, shared by bureaucrats, shared by politicians, and shared by government officials, rather than given by nature or evolutionary processes. Okay, so that's a very important critique. So the first point represents this idealist approach to social life, and in its emphasis is sharing of ideas. It is also social in a way which the opposing materialist views emphasize biology, like, getting angry, mad, and, being violent and aggressive, and technology, about nuclear weapons, making guns and weapons, bullets, and obviously the environment, the demography or the geography, the location of the country. So constructivism could therefore be seen as a kind of structural idealism, different than structural materialism. Okay. The version of constructivism, because now we're actually talking about Alexander Wendt, a big opponent in relation to realism, but a proponent of constructivism. He defends, therefore, structurationist and symbolic interactionism, and according to concedes important points to materialist and individualist perspectives, and endorses a scientific approach to social inquiry. So Alexander Wendt also tries to be empirical. So he also tries to understand by working his way through different layers of empirical approaches. Wendt acknowledges that states have national interests, and national interests as consisting of physical survival. So constructivists do recognize within the international arena states have physical survival needs. Constructivists also recognize the autonomy of other states, the economic well-being, the need to be economic well-being for themselves, and obviously the collective self-esteem. So a country needs to feel good about themselves and not be denigrated or despised by other countries, etc. So, but he also says, Alexander Wendt says that states' interpretations of these needs, of these basic needs, tend to be biased in a self-interested direction. So that's a bias, which predisposes them to competitive. So it makes them automatically materialist or realist by competing for well-being, economy, etc. So in a way, realist politics. But this point does not mean, and this is very important, it doesn't mean definitely or absolutely that states are inherently self-interested. Okay, we will explain. Constructivism sees the world as socially constructed, as we said. This view refers to the nature of the meaning. So what's the meaning? Why do we have this idea? What does this idea mean? So meaning is very important. Meaning can be constructed at the society level and carried on or carried in international context. So there is this, example. I gave you this example the last time. If Britain has 500 nuclear weapons, it's less threatening to the United States than North Korea that would have 1 nuclear weapon or 2 nuclear weapons, because it's about the meaning. It's not, the threat doesn't come from the nuclear weapon, otherwise Britain would be a threat. So it's about the idea. It's about the meaning of that idea. It's how one state perceives the other. And, for realists and liberals, and these are certain, certain perspectives or frames of thought. And because the human being is violent by nature, it will seize the opportunity to, at the first instance, they will attack, something like that, So, and constructivists, they define this by idea and meaning. Therefore, nuclear weapons by themselves do not have any meaning unless we understand the social context. It further demonstrates that constructivists go beyond the material reality by including the effect of ideas and beliefs on world politics. So reality is always under construction. So reality keeps on changing. So change, social change, like the Soviet Union, was not a reality. It collapsed. And reality is therefore always under construction, and always under change. Meanings are not fixed. States are not fixed. Ideas are not fixed. Identities are not fixed. And therefore they can change. So it's a source of change. But it depends on the ideas and beliefs that actors hold. So if a state as an actor believes, defines and gives meaning to behavior of other states negatively, it will react negatively. But if you perceive it positively, even though maybe it's not positive all the way, but you can approach it, you can calculate it. We will talk about this constructivist perspective. So it's not naive. It's how you define the situation and what you want to do about that situation. So it's always changing. So change also means it could be good, it could be bad. But you can also, from the constructivist perspective, be in a position that you have to defend yourself. It could also be defensive, but it's about the idea that everything can change, and from that perspective of realism, things don't change. See, that's the biggest difference between these schools of thought. Let's move on, because we talked about agency and structure. We said the last time that agency can be understood as the ability of someone to act upon those ideas. So an agent is a person or an institution or state that acts, behaves. It has the capacity, ability to act. Whereas structure, from a constructivist perspective, referring to the international system, could be ideational, it could be culture, it could be language. For realists, it could be material. For liberals, it could be institutional. So this argues that identities are plastic and they can be molded. So if they can be defined, they can be redefined. If they are shaped, they can be reshaped. Okay? So this is the basic notion of constructivism. So Alexander Wendt's example that the social relation of enmity, of rivalry, competition between the United States and North Korea represents the intersubjective structure. It's subjective. It's from their own perspective. So if you don't know, what was the biggest problem between the United States and the Soviet Union? It was intersubjective structure. They didn't know about each other's intentions. So they were not communicating. Remember prisoner's dilemma? Both prisoners, as long as they don't communicate from that perspective, they will defect. They will cheat on each other. But if there is communication, things can change. Yes, communism versus capitalism. It's about the ideas, right? So communism is also an idea. The constructivists would say it's an idea. Capitalism is an idea. It's an idea, and it's about what does it mean to you. So let's move on. So, but both actors, we've seen in 1990 that both actors had the capacity, therefore the agency, to change or reinforce. They were able to change those relationships, existing structure. So there was a structural change. If these beliefs and ideas change, the social relationship can change to one of friendship. This stance differs considerably from that of realists, who argue that the anarchic structure of the international system determines the behavior of states. Constructivists, on the other hand, argue that anarchy is what states make of it. So that's a big difference. So for realists, for example, the behavior of the states is preset. It's defined. You know what they will do. They will act. They will attack at the first opportunity. But for constructivists, this is not predefined. As I said, things can change. Relationships can change, ideas can change, and we've seen that things have changed, right? Okay. Neorealists see the structure of the international system as a distribution of material capabilities. Neoliberals see it as capabilities plus institutions because they have added to the material base and institutional superstructure. So basically, neoliberals believe in neo-realist superstructure, the material distribution of material capabilities plus the institutional variable as a superstructure. And constructivists see it as distribution of ideas. So distribution of material capabilities, distribution of institutions, and the distribution of ideas. So materialist and individualist commitments lead Wendt to conclude that anarchy makes international politics unnecessarily conflictual. Self-help world. So because it's conflictual, every state for itself. Every state helps itself. Idealist and holist commitments lead Wendt to view that anarchy is what states make of it. So according to constructivism, Wendt is wrong, and anarchy is how we define, how we as individuals or states define that anarchy should be defined as meaning. Okay, so Wendt's premise is that since states are the dominant form of subjectivity in contemporary world politics, so in other words, constructivists like Alexander Wendt, they do not deny that states are agents. So as state is a very important, significant actor, agent for realists, constructivists also agree that states are the primary unit of analysis for thinking about the global regulation of violence in terms of sovereignty and legitimacy to use armies, police, and weaponry. For example, the identity of a small state, we gave this example. I don't know whether it is necessary, but the interests depend actually on the size of the states. A small state will have different priorities than a large state. The actions of a state should be aligned with its identity. This is what a constructivist believes in. A constructivist argues that the state identity is formed. It's formed by social conditions, by social context, by religious factors, by economic factors, by demography, by geography, size of the land, population size, and all this has constructed an identity, a state identity. And in order to be able to have interests, first identity, the state identity must be constructed. So let's think of an individual. An individual cannot act without an identity. First of all, I need to have an identity, and once I know who I am, I know what my interests will be. Okay, so the notion of identity is crucial for behavior. And as a political scientist, we look at the state behavior domestically, internationally. We look at how it behaves. So what is that state identity? How do you define that state identity, and what does it mean for your interests? So there is a relation, for constructivists, there is a relationship between identity and interests. So a state, therefore, cannot act against or contrary to its own state identity, because this will call into question the validity of its identity, its stature, its status quo, including its preferences. It's just a theory. Okay, social norms are also central to constructivism. These are a standard of appropriate behavior for actors with a given identity. States conform to their identity and are expected to comply with the norms that are associated with the identity, which is also called the logic of appropriateness. So you live in Turkey, there are social norms, and people expect you to behave according to those norms. So that would be logical. So that would be the logic of acting, behaving appropriately. And people expect you to do that. Actors behave in certain ways because they believe this behavior is appropriate. Okay, and this also is the case, ethical, exactly, and this is also the case for states. So United States expects Turkey to behave in a certain way, because it has always been, for the last 100 years, it has been the case. But Turkey today has been changing its state identity. So the state identity of 30 years ago is not the same state identity of today, because we see that in its behavior, we see that in its interests, and how Turkey is pursuing its interests in the international arena. So it's very interesting to look at this from the perspective of realism. So is Turkey a realist country? Is Turkey a violent country from the realist perspective? Or is Turkey merely changing the definitions of identity structures in its own benefit and interests? So it's a big, interesting public debate. This should be, I try to follow the Turkish television as well, and there are interesting debates on the behavior. And some people are afraid, and some people are criticizing these kinds of policies. But it's very interesting from a scientific, scholarly perspective to look at these norms, social norms, political norms, the definition of its identities. So I'm not going to spend too much time on social norms. I'm going to move on. This you can read by yourself, Meltem. I will share this PowerPoint presentation so you can take a look at this, because we don't have much time and we have a lot of slides to move on, because I want to give you the essence of constructivism. So constructivists in general, there are types of constructivists, but I made some adaptation in this slide. Constructivists believe that it is possible to explain the world in causal terms. So in terms of empirical evidence, okay? And are interested in discovering the relationships between actors, social norms, interests, and identities, as I told you. So about the ideas, how are things empirically related to each other? So constructivism is also trying to be, set the boundary for science, scholarly work. Constructivists assume that actors act according to their identity. So this is a basic premise. It's an important premise, and that it is possible to predict when this identity becomes visible or not. When an identity is seen to be changing, conventional constructivists investigate what factors caused which aspects of a state's identity to change. So it's interesting. I just said Turkey would be an interesting case to look at how that identity would change, and how that would relate to aspects of states, interests and ideas and behavior. So another stream asks how actors come to believe in a certain identity. So another question is how do you come to the point of making that that identity, constructing that identity? So constructives are interested in the effect that identity has. What kind of effect has this identity for the country in international arena or in terms of foreign affairs? And then we would try to reconstruct that. For example, think of a paper, an article, a scholarly article where we reconstruct that identity. How did that come about? That is, find out what are the individual components of that identity, which they believe are created through written or spoken communication. So among and between peoples. Language plays, in that sense, a key role. So you follow identity by what you say. What are you saying? What kind of words are you using? Would that be language, be realism, neo-realist language? Would that be neoliberal language? Or would that be something else? Okay, so that would tell us something about the identity. So this is one way of looking at it. For Waltz, Neoreal focus, being mainly on material forces, accepts the international relations between states from a survivalist, evolutionary, survival of the fittest, Darwinian perspective. This suggests that states, in a way, are autistic. Well, what does it mean, autistic? It means black and white. It's either this or that. It's either survival. It's nominal. It's binominal. It means it's A or B. You have to make a choice. It's life or death. So that's autistic, and therefore it's self-help, and you can only help yourself. So if you want to help other people, you will not survive. For Wendt, state identities are complex. So for constructivists, it's not that easy. It's not that black and white. Since identities are constructed by many factors, such as ideas, domestic culture, values, norms that states' identities possess. This notion broadens the systemic theorizing and the complexity of layers. Okay, so it's systemic. So what constructivism tries to do is not remain reductionist, but systemic. So what does a system mean? System theory is that you have a big system structure, and within that structure system there are many parts. So if you do something here, it will have influence, it will spread, the influence will spread. So it's very complex systemic structures. Okay, so that's what constructivism says it is. Therefore, the structural emphasis, so the power distribution or distribution of ideas, especially realist structural definition, is not really logical. Since process, the interaction or the rules of the game, the process is excluded by realists, and structure is overvalued. I mean, the distribution of force, distribution of material force. So constructivists argue that identities play an important role, as important as material forces. So as you can see, constructivism don't say that material distribution is not important. It is important, but ideas are as important as material distribution of power. So these identities are existent and they are dynamic, meaning plastic. So it's not static. Identities are plastic, are hard to change. I mean, they can be changed, but it takes a lot of time to change. So constructivists would say, yes, things can change, but it will take some time to establish new norms, new ideas. And for example, in case of Turkey, the new identity, state identity, took almost 20 years, right? And still it's problematic. And so it's a long process, it's a slow process, but things can change. This is a very famous slogan or phrase when it says identities are not carved in stone. So it means that things can change. We have 20 minutes, so I'm going to move a little bit on. I'm going to skip this example. You can read it. So explanatory power of Waltz's materialist theory of structure are the explicit elements of anarchy. Anarchy meaning lawless, it states there is no central government. All states are individual states and they interact with each other, and the distribution of material capabilities. These rest on the assumption about the distribution of interests. Wendt argues that these interests are in turn constituted largely by ideas. If you say this to a realist, they will get mad, because what Wendt actually saying is that even realism, the assumption of realism that survivalist theory is an idea. It's an idea. I mean, constructivists would say we don't live in the forest, in the law of nature anymore. I mean, we live in cities, and the conditions have changed. Conditions have changed. So the way we communicate has changed. So realism might have been true maybe 500, 600 years ago, and it might still be valid if things would go bad. But at this moment in our time, constructivism is more appropriate for our age. So Wendt agrees that some ideas may play a role to attain material interests. Obviously, I mean, states need material resources, right? So they need to be able to defend themselves if something would happen. But Wendt says, even though we accept that, it's not always the case. I mean, these are still ideas, and ideas can constitute other meanings and interests. So interests can change. In this sense, ideas and state identity need to be there before suggesting that these interests are also socially constructed. Socialization, this is another debate between realists and constructivists, because argue that socialization affects the material would be to argue that material structure is shaped by process. So what actually is said here is that neorealism rejects socialization, because it's not, neorealists don't use the argument of process of interaction. They would use the argument of structure, not process. So it's an interaction or socialization of individuals to behave in a certain way would contradict the neorealist perspective. In that sense, socialization is rejected. And to argue that socialization affects ideational attributes means a social structure defined not merely as patterned behavior but as shared understandings. Neorealism also rejects this. So socialization affecting ideational attributes would suggest a social structure. So for realists, it's not social, it's material. So socialization or conditioning of individuals is not the case. It's not God-given. God created men violent, competitive, and conflictuous. So that's why it made sense. The Cold War made sense. It was competitive. I mean, they were competing for, more weapons and survival. And if it collapses, how do you explain that? I know a realist would say, well, because the Soviet Union was bankrupt and they were not able to pay anymore for the weapons. But that doesn't explain why they didn't hit the button of nuclear weapons. On both cases, the possibility that socialization might change state properties would challenge a purely materialist view of structure. Walls is forced to limit socialization to behavioral conditional. So in a way, realism says, well, human beings are like animals. And constructivists reject that idea. So let me see. We have 15 minutes, and I want to go into the core. Wendt argues that ideas constitute interests. If in some sense interests are ideas, then the causal idea versus interest model will be incomplete. This does not mean that all ideas are interests. Most are not, nor does it mean that interests no longer have an independent explanatory role. So again, constructivists do not reject the necessity of resources, economy, but as I told you, it is about the changeability of the situation, of the conditions, and ideas do explain, or the material interests do explain as much as they did before, and they exist independently of ideas that do not constitute them as required by causal explanations. So the claim is only that among the different kinds of ideas are some that constitute interest. So basically he says, yes, true, we accept these material forces are there, but we can transcend, we can become more than only thinking about survival. So what constructivists would actually say is that transcending would suggest, if I have the idea of my own well-being, and I think of your well-being, there is a common interest. So we can also think differently and we can help each other. So instead of self-help, it would be me helping you and you helping me, other help. So that would be a greater good. And that way we would even survive better. See? It's a different approach, but it's an idea. And that would be a constructivist way of thinking. So basically on this slide, if you look at the bottom of the slide, it says, but in the end, their interests are mostly a function of their ideas, not their genes. So it's not genetic, it's not biological, again. It's not, human being is not an animal. So state as an actor is a real corporate being to which one can properly attribute human quality. So constructivists in a way attach human-like attributes to states, to government, to foreign policies, identities, interests, and intentionality. So the state has a self, and this is very Lockean. This is John Locke talking here. So John Locke has written a piece about identity, and this is, you know, Alexander Wendt is following in the footsteps of Locke. So it says a state has a self. It has a self, as suggested by the realist assumption that states are self-interested. Even realists say self-interest, right? So there is a self. So that means that there is an identity, and identities change. State action depends on the actions of those individuals, since social structures only exist in virtue of the practices which instantiate them. These temporal and existential continuities are explained by structures of collective knowledge to which individuals are socialized and which they, through their actions, in turn reproduce. So actually, I would be repeating myself again if I decipher this text. So structures only exist in virtue. Structures are there because of ideas, and ideas define interests. And if you, in a way, this passage says, if a state identity is realistic, neo-realistic, it will try to reproduce itself. And that's not really good. But if it's a constructivist approach, it will try to reproduce that idea, because culture is generated, or transferred from one generation to another generation. So the state actors are real and not reducible to individuals. We do not reduce states to individuals, but we attain them individual-like attributes. This is true of most social structures, not just states. Most social structures are not corporate agents, and as such are not capable of intentional action. In order to become an agent, a structure must have three particular features: an idea of corporate agency. So there's got to be an idea of what we mean by a government. I mean, a government is an idea, right? So in order to have a structure become an agent within a structure, there must be the idea of government, government agency. There must be a decision structure, parliament, executive branch, a parliament where decisions and policies are made, ministries, departments, that both institutionalizes and authorizes collective action. So when there is an action, it's a collective action. It's all encompassing and including. Let me see. I'm going to skip this. Interest, personal, corporate, skip this, interest and ideas. Okay, this second paragraph, this is important. So what we're saying, actually, Alexander Wendt says in his book, he says there are three waves, or three kinds of structure at the macro level. There's also a micro level. We're not going to talk about the micro level objective, subjective, but we're going to take a look at the macro level based on what kinds of roles. And this could be a state considering another state enemy, a state considering another state rival, a state considering another state friendly. The first one would be Hobbesian. Hobbes would say, well, enmity, enemy, thinking, threat, fear, survival, in those terms. Rival would be Lockean, more liberal, neoliberal, based on trade, competing in terms of economic arguments and institutional argument. And friend would be Kantian. The Kant idea, considering a holistic approach where harmony would be more important. But these are just labels, and these are just metaphors that Alexander Wendt uses for this enemy, rival, friend structure, and to define the logic of anarchy. He actually says there is no logic of anarchy. It's how we define it. I mean, if we define it this way and we all agree in terms of enemy, then it would be that would be the only logic. If we would define it by rivalry, that would be the logic of anarchy. If you would define it by friendship, other help, that would be the logic of anarchy. So in his book, he talks extensively about these enemy, rival, and friend categories. But it says something about, so how do we place this position, this way of thinking? This would be, as I said, it's about how the international arena is defined and agreed amongst the states. So that would define the relationship, the interaction, the process, and the structure, as well as the agency in the context of foreign policies. So let me see. So if structures are always in process, so this is important. So structures are actually always in process. A theory of structural change must explain why their instantiating processes change. So this explains, so if structures are always in process, we can understand why the Soviet Union collapsed. So the rationalist strategy treats identities and interests as exogenously given, externally given, and constant, and focus on the factors shaping actors' expectations. Structural change occurs when the relative expected utility of normative versus divine behavior changes. So the constructivist strategy, in another way, treats identities and interests as endogenous to interaction and thus a dependent variable in the process. So that means interaction can be, because since interaction within the constructivist perspective is a dependent variable in terms of process or interaction, it means that ideas are independent variable, so ideas have an explanatory power over interaction. So that's big, that's very important. So this sentence, structures always being in process, explains social structure, structural change, okay? So that's the basic idea of the big debate between constructivists and realists. So last slide. The strategies are not mutually exclusive, but they're different, with different ideas about what is going on in structural change and what causes it to happen. So what is the cause? Why is this structural change happening? Is something that for constructivists to sink in their teeth. From a constructivist perspective, the mark of a fully internalized culture. A fully internalized culture is that actors identify with it, have made it the generalized other. So if you believe as a country, as a state, the other is the other and we are we, it's fully defined, it's fully internalized, it's become a culture, part of their understanding of their self. So the part of you, identity, is seeing another as an enemy. This identification this sense of being part of a group, we, is a social or collective identity that gives actors an interest in the preservation of their culture. So the other would be dangerous, a threat for your existence, for the existence of your state, culture, etc. We experience this every day, everywhere in the world. It's also called the populistic extreme right way of thinking. So the collective interests mean that actors make the welfare of the group. So this is very important, and we will end with this. So collective interests. Well, now we're talking about collective interest, the global interest. Think of the climate change. It means, so there is a meaning. It means that actors, states, if they make the welfare of the whole globe a priority, an end, a priority in itself for themselves, it will in turn help them overcome the collective action problems that are beset by egoists. So if you have this common goal, we will solve the climate change together. That's how we will survive together. It's a big decision. It will have influence on your culture, on your identity, and your actions as states. But eventually, you will overcome a collective action. You will not be alone to solve the problem. When their culture is threatened, a well-socialized, this is important, well-socialized, a socialized actor state will tend instinctively to defend it. So actors are still rational, but the unit on the basis of which they calculate utility and rational action is the group. It's not anymore me, but as a group, how do we survive? So that's a different way of looking at it, different way of identity. Is it possible to realize? It's about if we can transcend as humanity into something better, into a global common purpose. So that's the big question. That's the big question mark. But as long as we remain egotistic and not moral, not ethical, it's not going to happen. So I tried to explain constructivism in 2 hours. Last time we started, and this time I tried to give you the basics of constructivism. I hope it was clear. I hope it was clear. If it's not, please let me know. We will try to answer your questions. But constructivism at the end of, this is week 11, so we have 3 more lectures to go, and we will look into other ideas as well. But we might revisit constructivism in the next 3 weeks or not. We will see. But I hope that it was clear. I'm very fond of this theory. I love talking about it, and I hope happiness, health, and prosperity to you and your family. And I hope you will have a good weekend, have a good rest, and enjoy your time. See you next time. Bye-bye.